Hello, hello. Welcome back to And One More Thing. This is the podcast where we talk about one more thing from this past Sunday's sermon. My name is Paul Mente, and this right here is...
Matt Dixon. Paul, what'd you do last night?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm kind of suffering from a food hangover, to be honest, to put it lightly. I um I got the urge at like 9:30 last night to run to the grocery store and get some stuff for a Philly cheesesteak. And so I got, it was literally like fresh made bread, not fresh because it was probably made earlier the day, but mostly fresh. And it was about like that big, a little over a foot, maybe a foot, something like that. And I got some steak and I got some cheese and I got some peppers and onions and mushrooms and all that stuff. And it turned out it was really good, but now I'm kind of suffering from it now. Like my stomach is like, you ate too much, and now I'm struggling. But hey, we're here, we're doing it. What'd you do last night?
Put the baby to bed, and then
Nice.
it was like a longer day yesterday, so we just vegged at the end, went to bed at a nice early hour. So we were probably in bed by the time you were going out to get your
Okay.
cheesesteak, not
Yeah,
cheese steak.
not my proudest moment, but sometimes you get the urge, so.
Hey, you're only 20. Okay, talking about Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45. Absolutely love this story. Jesus cleanses a leper. Title of the sermon was The Pity and Power of Jesus. We see the request in verse 40, where the leper comes to Jesus and begs him, saying, "Hey, I know you can do this, but if you will make me clean, I'll be clean." Then we see the response of Jesus in verses 41 through 42, where we see the heart of Jesus, right? Where he's moved with pity. And it's not just an emotion, but it's an emotion that leads to an action. Jesus' pity leads to him touching the leper, which is just completely unheard of, doesn't happen, according to the law. But Jesus touches the leper and says, "I will be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, which I think is cool. Like that's kind of a personification of leprosy, right? The leprosy left him. Like the leprosy got out of town at that moment and he is made clean. Then we see the rebuke of Jesus in verses 43 through 44, which is kind of a stunning turn of the story. It's kind of warm and lovey-dovey up until this point. Jesus is like, "I love you. I'm going to touch you and heal you." And then all of a sudden it like leads into a direct rebuke in verses 43 through 44, where Jesus literally snorts at the man, sends him packing, like, "Get out of my face. Don't tell anybody about this, and go fulfill the law and show yourself to the priests." And then finally in verse 45, we see the refusal, or the rebellion, where this leper received this great healing from Jesus. He was made clean by Jesus, but then directly rebels against him, went out and began to talk freely about it. I don't think this is a positive thing. I think it's a negative thing, and it hampers Jesus's work and ministry, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. So that's the story. I think the main takeaway, as the title of the sermon indicates, is the pity and power of Jesus, that he was moved with pity, but also had the great power to make this man clean. And then we have the negative example of the leper who wanted the benefit of Jesus' power, but didn't want to submit to his lordship. So I think that's a negative example for us to follow, and a promise to claim in the person of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the sermon. What's one thing that stood out to you, Paul?
I'll quote you real quick. You said when talking about the leopard and the leopard touching Jesus, you said when Jesus touched the unclean, Jesus does not become unclean. The unclean becomes clean.
Mm.
And I think that's just such an awesome concept. And the first time that I heard that concept was when I was reading this book called Gentle and Lowly. I'll recommend it at the end or something. If we have a little time, we can talk about it. But the first time I came across that concept was when I was reading that book, and just the way that touched me was crazy. Like he talks about in the book where Jesus like reverses the law in a way where the law said that whoever touched a leopard would become unclean.
Mhm.
And Jesus perfectly representing the law, being completely clean and perfectly morally perfect. When he touches that leopard, like it's just such a mind-blowing idea that that Jesus doesn't become unclean in that time where the law would say Jesus is unclean now, but instead Jesus, because he is so clean, makes the leper clean again. It's
Yeah.
just like it's such an awesome thing to see Jesus like reversing the law in a way. And then you just really see the compassion of Jesus in this story. It reminds me like of his compassion with the woman with the issue of blood and everything, where he's filled with pity towards them, and it shows that this is like Jesus's natural instinct towards the dirty or the unclean. And you can apply that to like morally unclean as well, is that he is filled with pity, moved with pity, like it says in verse 41, like that his inward being is filled with compassion. And it's just like it's such a cool concept to understand Jesus as a human being who has human emotions as well. And of course, God has those emotions too. Those are divine emotions as well. But just to like dwell in the humanity of Jesus as well is something that I feel like we need to do a lot too. And you touched on that a little bit last week as well. When you talked about like, it's not easy to get up in the morning. Jesus didn't have a good time getting up in the morning, probably, where like he is still human and he still dealt with the human struggles. But I just think that that point of Jesus making the unclean clean because he is the clean one, that's just it's such a hard-hitting truth. And when I first read that in that book, I immediately teared up. That's literally the second chapter in that book that I highly recommend, but we can talk about it later. But I love
Well,
that.
you've already talked about it, brother. I think you got
Yeah,
good. Is
I've
there
really been plugging it. Yeah.
anything else you want to say about it, or is that
Um, I mean, not really. Here it is. I have it with me, gentle and lowly. If you want to know more about the heart of your Lord Jesus, just the human, or more like the emotionalness of Jesus, this is a great book. I mean, the life-changing perspectives, I would say, in here. Like it's all biblical perspectives, and each chapter is like headed with a passage, which I think is awesome. But like the perspective is just it's life changing. You'll see Jesus for who he is, this compassionate, gentle person, and it's really good. So I recommend highly.
wonderful? One thing that stood out to me in this is I think in the grand picture of the narrative, we see a picture of the gospel in the characters of the narrative, let me say. So remember what we read about the leper in Leviticus 13:45 through 46. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Right? So the leper's uncleanness led him to live alone outside the camp. Now, the camp just meant community, right? So you couldn't live in the town, you couldn't live with people, you had to live outside the camp by yourself. So in the story, we see a man who was outside the camp come to a man who was inside the camp, right? As you mentioned, like Jesus is so perfectly clean. I think I said yesterday, his conquering holiness, where he touches someone and they become clean, he doesn't become defiled. Jesus was more than anybody inside the camp, right? He was allowed in the community. He was perfectly clean. So we see a man who is outside the camp come to a man who's inside the camp. But since the man inside the camp showed such pity and compassion to the man outside the camp, Jesus, the man inside the camp, was forced to go outside the camp. So, it says so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, right? And that happened to him while the man outside the camp was now able to go inside the camp as a perfectly clean man. So, in other words, Jesus, in a sense, in this story, trades places with the leper. He bears the shame that the leper deserved, right? So, Jesus kind of pays the price, if you will, by going outside the camp so that that man can come inside the camp. And that's what we see Jesus obviously do on the cross. And remember, we haven't got there yet, but we're about to get there in a couple days in our Bible reading. Hebrews 13, 11 through 13 says, "For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured." So I think this is so cool because Jesus dies outside the camp as a sacrifice. He gets excluded from the community. He gets alienated himself. He dies and trades places with us outside the camp. And so Hebrews, the author of Hebrews here, uses this to encourage us to go with him and suffer with Christ, outside the camp. And so I just think it's kind of if you really zoom out, you see a picture of the gospel here of Jesus trading places with the sinner getting to enjoy what Jesus should enjoy, and Jesus suffering what the sinner should suffer.
Why didn't you add that in?
Felt a little convoluted. Thought it was good.
Yeah, it probably would have been a little difficult to explain all that too.
Yeah. I kept saying inside the camp, outside the camp, outside the camp, inside the camp. I was like, let's just say this for the podcast. I think it's good stuff, but it's hard to communicate a little bit. So, so there we go. Love you guys. We're starting Mark chapter 2. Thanks for chugging along with us. If you need anything, let us know. We'll be here for you. We'll be studying Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12 this Sunday.
Okay. It's a big chunk.
Yeah. All right. You got any last words, Paul?
No, I don't think so. Just get this book. Get it.
You go.
Recommend.
Here's the book I recommend.
Whatever. You can't want to.